21 games, 2 controllers, one sweet deal. Now you're playing with power. Super power.
The Super Nintendo has a rich legacy that spans decades. It is marked by various revivals and adaptations that keep its memory alive in the hearts of gamers worldwide. But before we go into the details of the legacy of the Super Nintendo, we should first rewind the clock back to 1994, which is seen as a pivotal year in the system's life. At that time, other systems were touting their add-ons and technical superiority, while Nintendo would head in another direction. The TurboGrafx-16 almost launched with its CD add-on, but it didn't really add much value, at least for North American consumers, and the system didn't fare too well. Even before 1994, the system would get a complete redesign, repackage, and rebranding. However, the system would be declared dead in 1994 in North America. Sega released their own CD attachment in the holiday season of 1992, and there were reports of Nintendo working on their own CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, first with Sony and then with Philips. Both of these collaborations would backfire for Nintendo. As a result of the deal with Philips, it would allow for one of the rare times that Nintendo would license their IPs to a third-party developer with little oversight and control. This led to the infamously abysmal titles on the Philips CDI, including 3 Zelda titles and Hotel Mario. As for Nintendo's partnership with Sony, Sony would decide to enter the market themselves and even kept the name of their project with Nintendo, calling their new console the PlayStation. And while a prototype of the Nintendo PlayStation surfaced years later, neither project, either from Sony or Philips, would see the light of day in the commercial video game market. Though it's a question long debated amongst gamers, one can only speculate how the video game market would be different today had Nintendo and Sony, or Nintendo and Philips, kept up their alliance. Instead of releasing add-ons to extend the capabilities of the Super Nintendo, Nintendo would eventually end up building them into their cartridges, starting in 1993 with the release of Star Fox, which is a completely 3D rail shooter, the first on the platform. Thanks to an embedded graphics chip marketed as the Super FX chip, the capabilities of the Super Nintendo were greatly enhanced. A few more games would utilize this graphics chip, but another trick that didn't require extra chips in the cartridge to extend the capabilities of the system was the use of pre-rendered graphics. With each project released by Nintendo using these tricks, Nintendo would advertise that this was done without the use of additional hardware being added onto the console externally. This not only helped Nintendo compete against Sega, but would also help them compete against the new consoles that were being released with more powerful hardware. When other companies were moving on to 32-bit systems and beyond, Rare and Nintendo proved that the Super Nintendo was still a strong contender in the market. In November of 1994, they would release Donkey Kong Country, which was a platform game featuring 3D models and textures that were pre-rendered on Silicon Graphics workstations. With its detailed graphics, fluid animation, and high-quality music, Donkey Kong Country rivaled the aesthetic quality of the video games that were being released on the newer 32-bit CD-based systems. In fact, despite being released in the last part of 1994, 6.1 million copies were sold, making it the fastest-selling video game in history to that point. The game would effectively convey to gamers that the early 32-bit systems had little to offer over the Super Nintendo, and it kept the Super Nintendo being a strong contender until the release of the Nintendo 64 in 1996. In fact, looking at the top 5 best-selling games in December of 1996, 2 of them were games for the Super Nintendo. In October of 1997, Nintendo would release a redesigned model of the Super NES, known as the SNES-101 model, and referred to as the new style Super NES. It would release in North America for $99, with some units including a pack-in game, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. Like the earlier new style NES model, it is slimmer and lighter than its predecessor, but it lacks S-video and RGB outputs that was possible through the multi-video connector in the earlier systems. This redesign was renamed to the Super Famicom Jr in Japan at around the same time, however the redesign stayed out of Europe altogether. Taking a look at the console redesign, you could tell on the outside that the power and reset buttons were moved to be on the same side of the console, while the cartridge eject button and power LED indicator were actually removed entirely. Taking a look inside of the console, you can see that the hardware has been condensed into an SoC design, or System on a Chip. This would allow them to reduce the cost of the motherboard greatly, as they didn't have as many chips to produce for the system. They also took out the bottom expansion slot that was available on the Super Nintendo, as it was never used in the United States, but it would render it completely incompatible with Japan's exclusive Stellaview add-on. The console only natively supports composite video outputs, but you can re-enable the RGB video and S-video outputs with a few modifications. The internal RF modulator was also removed, requiring an external one if you wanted to have your console hooked up to an older TV that does not support composite video. Due to the SoC design of this system, it is highly sought after by Super Nintendo and Famicom enthusiasts, since its RGB video quality, if restored, is actually improved over earlier internal revisions of the system. And as far as I can tell, the console redesign shells are not as prone to yellowing as the earlier systems were. If you take a look at my childhood Super Nintendo, it has definitely gotten yellowed over the years, despite being well cared for in a smoke-free home. The yellowing of the older systems is due to the ABS plastic that was used in some of the casting on older Super Nintendo and Super Famicom consoles. It is theorized that with my system here, that there was actually two different batches of plastic used, which creates this two-tone look, with the outer shell mostly being yellow, but around the cartridge slot and the controller connectors, they're actually not as yellowed as the rest of the system. This whole process can be reversed with retrobrighting, but I decided to go ahead and leave mine as is for now, and just got another system that doesn't suffer from this issue as much. As the early 3D console wars progressed, Nintendo would cease production of the Super NES in North America in 1999, about 2 years after releasing their final first-party game, Kirby's Dream Land 3. The final game to release in the United States was Frogger, and it was released a year prior to the console's discontinuation in 1998. However, Nintendo would continue production of both the Famicom and Super Famicom until September 25, 2003. A few years later, Nintendo would release the Game Boy Advance, a system that was seen as having similar capabilities to the Super Nintendo, and many Super Nintendo games were ported to the Game Boy Advance. This allowed gamers for the first time to have that kind of game experience in the palm of their hands and portable, but also introduced a new generation of players to the library of the Super Nintendo. Around the time of the release of the Nintendo Wii in 2005, it was made known that Super Nintendo games would be made available for download via the Wii's Virtual Console service. Super Nintendo games would go portable once again, with Nintendo announcing that they would be bringing their Super Nintendo game library on the new Nintendo 3DS, 3DS XL, and later the Nintendo 2DS XL, via the eShop download service. On September 29th of 2017, Nintendo released something called the Super NES Classic Edition, which is a dedicated home video game system released by Nintendo which emulates the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It comes with 21 games pre-installed and cannot be added onto unless you mod the system. This console also includes the first official release for the cancelled Star Fox 2 that was originally supposed to hit the Super Nintendo in 1996 or 1997. This game console's appearance varies based on the region you bought your system in, as each system was designed to match what the Super Nintendo looked like in their region. On the inside of the system, this console uses an all-winner R16 system on a chip that has 4 ARM Cortex-A7 processing units, with a customized ARM 400 MP2 graphics processing unit, along with 512 megabytes of flash storage and 256 megabytes of DDR3 memory. As they use emulation on this system, it might not be surprising that this is the same exact hardware they used in their previous NES Classic Edition product. This system features a 720p running at 60Hz HDMI display outputs with 2 controller ports that had 2 wired Super Nintendo controllers being bundled with the system, and those use the same style of connector that was used on Wii remotes. And yes, if you want to, you can plug these into your Wii remotes and use them to play Super Nintendo games via the Wii's Virtual Console service. You can even plug in a Wii Classic controller and use that as well on your Super Nintendo Classic. Addressing a complaint that was common on the Nintendo Entertainment System Classic is that the cords for the controllers are a bit longer, being about 4.5 feet long, or 1.4 meters, compared to the 2.5 foot ones on the NES Classic, or 0.76 meters. The games that are built into the system are titles that were critically acclaimed on the system, including a good mix of those from Nintendo's first party, as well as some from Square Enix, Konami, and Capcom. One of the biggest criticisms of this console was the availability. Nintendo was often accused of shorting the units intentionally to create a higher demand. However, Nintendo has always maintained that they were simply caught off guard with how popular the system ended up being, with at one point Nintendo of America's CEO Reggie stating in September of 2017 that people should refrain from buying SNES Classics from scalpers and suggested that SNES Classic systems would be readily available when they launched. Nintendo would end up producing these systems a lot longer than they originally intended, and decided that after the 2018 holiday season, they would discontinue the NES Classic and Super Nintendo Classic, and did not have any plans to make any similar mini-console versions of any other home systems in the near future. And up to the present day, you can still play Super Nintendo games through Nintendo Switch's Nintendo Switch Online service, with new games being added periodically. By the time the Super Nintendo ended production, there were approximately 41.9 million Super Nintendos sold worldwide, with over 23 million of those systems being sold in the Americas alone, and about 17 million of them sold in Japan. Though these sales figures made the Super NES a huge success for Nintendo around this time frame, it failed to sell the number of units their original Nintendo Entertainment System did, which was around 61.91 million units. In the late 90s, the Super Nintendo was beginning to show its age, with a team of 5 Electronic Gaming Monthly editors giving the Super Nintendo scores of around 5.5 to 8 out of 10, criticizing how few new games were coming out for the system, and how dated the graphics and sound were compared to the current generation. Though the reviews in that magazine did state that the number of must-have titles for the Super Nintendo remained unsurpassed. Mostly, the system was still being recommended due to the fact that you can find plenty of titles in bargain bins, and the system's redesign was very cheap as well. In 2007, the game website Game Trailers named the Super Nintendo as the second best console of all time, only behind the PlayStation, in their top 10 list of consoles that left their mark on the history of gaming. They specifically cited its graphics, sound, and library of top-quality games. In 2015, the same website would name the Super Nintendo as Nintendo's best system of all time. Many other game publications since then have followed suit, putting the Super Nintendo as either the top console or very close to the top spots in a top 10 list. And perhaps due to its game library, the Super Nintendo console has been a target and goal for emulators ever since the system's discontinuation. Super Nintendo emulators started popping up online as early as 1996, and since then, some of the emulation projects have merged to form the standard Super Nintendo or SNES 9X, which is still supported in some variation to this day. Nintendo of America has maintained its stance against the distribution of Super NES ROM image files and the use of emulators, as it does with the NES, insisting that these things represent flagrant copyright infringement. Those who support emulation have asserted that their discontinued hardware production constitutes an abandonware status. The owner's right to make personal backups, space shifting for private use, the development of homebrew games, the frailty of ROM cartridges and consoles, and the lack of certain foreign imports have also been used to justify emulation and legally possessing ROM files. Despite the ongoing battle, unofficial emulators for the Super Nintendo remain available on most available hardware platforms. To be honest, I can't think of a single year that I've gone without playing a game from this system. It's always been hooked up to a television in my house, and it's something I constantly go back to, and a lot of my friends that I have when I come over and game with me want to play the Super Nintendo as well. The system boasts cutting-edge graphics and a rich library of games that made the Super Nintendo a cultural phenomenon, captivating a global audience and solidifying Nintendo's dominance in the market. The console's enduring legacy can be traced through its innovative contributions to gaming technology, its beloved game titles, and its profound impact on the industry's revolution. At the heart of the Super Nintendo's legacy lies its technological prowess. The console would continue to push the boundaries of what home gaming could be, With their innovation of the Super FX chip, they were able to bring 3D graphics, although basic by today's standards, into the home for the first time for many. The magic of Mode 7 being built into the system allowed for some unique gameplay concepts that was not possible on previous gen hardware and pushed the industry forward. The Super Nintendo's emphasis on superior hardware paved the way for what subsequent generations of consoles would try to prioritize in its technical advancements. But while graphics are great on the Super Nintendo, I think the biggest legacy of the Super Nintendo is its game library. Featuring its timeless classic released at launch, Super Mario World, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and then keep going with games like Super Metroid and Donkey Kong Country, the console would deliver an unparalleled gaming experience. Those titles not only captivated players with their engaging gameplay, but also set the standard for narrative depth and character development in the medium. The fact that over 30 years later we're still playing these games has to say something about the enduring legacy of this system. The Super Nintendo also saw the emergence of some of Nintendo's most successful franchises, including Mario Kart making its first appearance on this system, but the system also helped see the rise of some of Nintendo's most popular characters, as Link from Link to the Past, Mario, and Samus would become cultural symbols transcending the gaming world. Nintendo's commitment to quality and innovation with the Super Nintendo laid the foundation for the future success of the company and cemented its reputation as a leading force in the industry. The SNES's impact is evident in the nostalgia it continues to evoke, with many gamers fondly reminiscing about the golden era of 16-bit gaming. At the end of all this, I can only say that the Super Nintendo Entertainment System's legacy extends far beyond its initial release, resonating with gamers and industry professionals alike. Its technological innovations, iconic game library, and lasting cultural impact have left an incredible mark on the gaming landscape. The SNES not only defined an era of gaming, but also set the stage for future generations of consoles, influencing the medium's evolution and ensuring its place in the pantheon of gaming history. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.